Thanks all for joining. Said Henk Ovink, very honored to chair this meeting. And when we talk about investments and water and agriculture, the current pandemic, is this a double whammy, as we say, or is it our best opportunity? In the context of the emerging climate crisis, the COVID recovery, and the relationship between water, agriculture, and food, what do we see happening? Are we making use of that? Are there opportunities, or is it only a bigger challenge? And mixing opportunities in this recovery with the challenges we face, also in the context of the climate, I'm very honored to have great speakers. We'll let you know. We have 2 presentations and then interventions from 3 speakers. First presentation will be by Ismail Oudra, Senior Irrigation and Rural Infrastructure Engineer at FAO at the Investment Center. The second one by Pieter Walewijn, Global Lead on Water and Agriculture at the World Bank. And then we have panel interventions by Marion Le Pommelec, Lead Specialist for Agriculture, Natural Resources and Rural Development. Marwan Latke, Principal Irrigation Engineer, Agriculture and Agro-Industry Department of the African Development Bank, and Clément Ouedraogo, the coordinator of the Regional Water Control Program and the Permanent Interstate Committee for Drought Control in the Sahel. So, as you can see, amazing speakers and panel. And without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor to Ismail for first presentations of 5 minutes, and I'll keep the time. Ismail, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hanks. I will first share my screen. Here you go. Thank you, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to you all. I'm delighted to be part of this very interesting discussion, and we'll try in the coming few minutes to share some insights on opportunities for investment, including those driven by innovation, but I should say centered around adaptation and innovations. But first, let's see where we stand with regards to the ag water situation. I should say that where we stand is actually not very encouraging, and we have seen from yesterday's presentations some of these aspects that were put forward, and we are facing a dual challenge with regards to water, with a growing population that put more pressure on demand for ag water to produce more food, but also to respond to the needs for human needs, other human needs. And we need to produce more with less water. We have an increasing urbanization that places great strain on already limited water resources, and that results in more stress created on environment, and we have environmental risks that as less water is left for our environment. And the other challenge is linked to climate change, and as it is expected to further reduce both water availability but also water quality. And all this leads to less water for people, and we are in a situation where per capita water availability is reaching very alarming levels, and mainly in the MENA region in particular. So no action is actually costly, and it leads to negative externalities. And to give 2 examples, yesterday we have seen some numbers regarding the cost of those externalities. I would like to share 2 very important figures. The first is that the failure to address investment in the water sector could actually diminish growth rates by as much as 6% of GDP by 2050. And the second one is that the scale of global economic losses related to water insecurity to existing irrigators was estimated at around 94 billion per year. So we need to adapt, and ag water management requires innovative solutions and also all the tools at disposal, and taking the possible interventions and investments to scale and achieving significant impact is a key challenge. And one of the limitations to achieving the scale is related to the funding. And we again, we have seen some of those figures put forward yesterday. I will add to that FAO estimated that around 960 billion will be required between 2005 and 2050 to ensure water for ag production in 93 developing countries. FPRI estimated that to meet the expected expansion of food demand by 2030, about 8 billion of annual investment will be needed in developing countries to expand irrigation and other systems, and an additional 2.4 billion is needed annually to make current system more efficient. Adaptation is have needs that to address the negative impacts of climate change for ag water management, and those needs are around I would say 7 challenges that needs to be addressed through different measures and investments.
Last minute, Ismail.
Okay, so those challenges are centered around variability in water availability, extreme events, loss of biodiversity, deterioration of water quality, and change in ag land. And some aspect of the investments to be addressed could be through either technological innovations, and there are many aspects of that, through modernization and harnessing innovation of technology to safeguard water for multiple uses. And there are, to be successful in implementing those technological innovations, we need to innovate in water policies and governance. And there are many aspects to be addressed to that regard, like water saving policies, quotas, pricing, and so on. And finally, we need innovative financial mechanisms, and like blended finance, green climate finance, green bonds, and de-risking mechanisms and others. And to conclude, I would say that nowadays water management ag is becoming increasingly complex, as water for ag often competes with other sectors, and therefore successful adaptation of water for ag requires combined efforts from other sectors, including financial, rural development, trade, industry, and environment, among others. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ismail. Very concise, great presentation. Also really shows the challenges we face dollar-wise on an annual as well as on a 2050 term scale. There is, of course, this real challenge on how a reduction of use and the dependency of water, a reuse mechanism, is actually informing the demand you put out on the table that is necessary to keep up with the increase in demand from the demography and economy. So there is a real challenge. Is this based on a current situation, or actually where you say efficiency? If we know that 70–80% of water is used up by agriculture businesses, that we have leaking infrastructure all over the planet, in the developed and in the developing world, there's quite an opportunity there too. Collaboration is key, as you are ending, across sectors and silos, and bringing in financials, of course. Thanks. Onwards to Peter Walewijn from the World Bank. Peter, the floor is yours. You have 8 minutes.
All right. So thanks, Hank. And this is a nice segue to the next one. So let me go quick. I think many people have opined on what the COVID crisis is telling us, and I'm not going in there in 8 minutes. But the what is I think clear is that this is the World Bank approach, and it's very common across all of us, that we need a more resilient, inclusive, sustainable, and efficient system. And efficient meaning more bang for the buck, really, and to make sure that the benefits of the agri-water sector, but in more general development, have to be more broadly spread. Now, as you said, Hank, and as people have been saying also yesterday, that's not a new problem. The sector needed to transition a long time. It didn't come about just now, but it's always been held together because the sector is too big to fail, right? There's huge investment needs in the sector. The sector is highly underfunded, as many people have tried to put numbers on that, as well as highly subsidized, and that gives an important focus on where we need to go. And I think that is we tend in discussions on agri-finance, but not yesterday, so there was a good discussion, but always to focus on how do we get more finance to the sector, rather than first answering the question, what do we offer the world, and that people care about this sector as a, with all its problems to solve and to attain higher level objectives. So I think these are the things we need to talk about. The persistent gaps that are there in feeding the planet. We have to face changing demands in agriculture. We have to address the environmental crisis that have just been already presented. But much of that is not a passive thing. It's things that we are actively working on and financing. As also yesterday, Guillaume showed us, much of the finance is in subsidies already that aren't necessarily supporting the right things, right? If we are saying we need more food for the planet, why are we subsidizing things that are not actually that great in nutritive value or in water productivity? So these are things that we need to think about. And that all came about in the COVID crisis. If we are seeing that there is fiscal stress, agencies are not able to deliver even the low level of delivery that they were delivering before. And also we see private sector being stressed in and placed on hold. And that's just the beginning, because climate is there, and we need to not only to frame water and agriculture in water adaptation, of course that's the big thing, but it's also in mitigation. The sector has a role to play in also reducing GHG and reducing its footprint on the planet. So these are major things, and this is the opportunity to broader articulate what is the value that's created, the social impact of water and agriculture, and how to shift around those topics. So if we talk about that first for a minute before we get to finance, is to say, okay, what are these we should only finance what is viable, and that's a basic understanding, but that's not typically where the financing has been. We should also articulate water and agriculture in a more resilient basins. What is the role of irrigation as a shock absorber? What is the role of water in a more broader watershed context? And then go to sustainable resource use, where the public support should be there to support public values and not necessarily partisan interest. The broader inclusive services, so reaching people who have not been served by traditional investment, and this is where farmer-led irrigation and these kind of models that yesterday were spoken about come in, and a more efficient service delivery, higher performance, that farmers are able to actually excel and thrive on their farms. And if we finance these values and we see this beyond the immediate production benefits and beyond the immediate where we always talk about efficiency gains, but talk about broader climate, environment, and multi-purpose objectives, we are onto something, I think, in this financing. This is a slide that is very known in OECD. I think this is coming from your corner. All the finance we are talking about is basically this, right? And what we always find in all our programs is that the problem is not the financing. Yes, we can put big numbers, and we have been doing that also, but the issue is that we have to work on the demand side. Agencies are not creditworthy. Farmers are unable to access the finance, so it is working with the private sector, with the finance sector, to be able to show what the long-term value proposition is, and then work on the financing tools to get there. So what is that value proposition? I think first is to show in good conscience asking for more money only after or together with reorienting the finance that's already there. So aligning ag and water subsidies, subsidies towards be less regressive, public finance to move forward for longer term success and be more accountable to these higher level objectives I just spoke about, and then only as a first enabler for private finance, which is the major finance in the sector in any case. And then tapping the private sector financing, which is that filling that big gap, which you can do after you do these two other things. So which is really all about untapping an uncatalyzed resource. And if we talk about private finance in irrigation, we have traditionally focused on PPPs, but there's so much other things and new things, and a lot of self-financing from farmers. That is the big thing in what we see in South Asia, in Africa, farmers making their own investments in irrigation, and that's the big jump. And how do we unlock that further? So and just to echo what yesterday was also said by Guillaume, we don't know a lot. We know things, but we don't know a lot about the levels of finance. We don't have a good handle on where the private finance is, what the levels and directions of subsidies are. I think it was amazing yesterday to see some figures on that, and we aim to get a better handle on this. This is just a quick illustration of that, where one of this is about India, of course, major irrigation country. The figures on where financing is on farm investment is all from self-financing from farmers and some from government subsidies, and that is, these are the movers and shakers where we can see where is this financing going and how can we bring that into this more outcome-oriented support. So ending on just where we need to head, there is a lot of category other, I would say, the things that we are seeing emerging, which is pay-as-you-go systems in farmer-led irrigation with equipment suppliers. There's business-to-business alliances, business-to-consumer alliances that are coming up in last-mile service delivery that we haven't seen before. More institutional orientation towards being able to finance smallholder farmers. Climate finance is always the promise and not so much a realization, but rice bonds have been spoken about, right? Where are we going with that? And then looking at the energy nexus, the productive energy incentives, which is the big driver, for instance, in the solar farming India story. So there's a lot to unpack, and I think this is Daniel Zimmer yesterday gave a lot of that, and also the other illustrations on cases. So these are the things that we have to build, and this is trust and building multi-stakeholder process with private sector, with farmers, with public financiers. This is a slow process because we have to get everybody along on this ride, and many are still in this old delivery, public delivery mode. And if we get here, we are trying to work on this by building, by making this part of the considered options. We are trying to document whatever we know about this, and yesterday we learned more on these islands of change in maximizing finance for development. But basically, where we see it is that the public, our role is to enable the public environment for private investment and supporting those common goods. So let me end there. I think it's a short message. We have to reorient the financing that we have to higher level objectives, to collaborate on co-creation of new solutions, to increase the financing, yes, for sure, to get more food and environment and biodiversity benefits for the planet, and to diversify, because the public finance is never going to make this gap closed. So with that, plenty of more details on that always, but let me leave you with these few thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Well said. I was really struck by the part where you highlighted the enabling capacity if you bring some of these forces together. If you look differently at agriculture, water, and finance, not from a problem perspective of a need in the context of growth and development, but as an enabling perspective, then in the right mix, it can be the enabler for water security, sustainable, inclusive, and economic development and climate action. So, but then that really demands a different perspective on what you're looking for. So I think that enabling capacity, not seeing ag, water, and finance as the problem, but as the driver for these solutions, knowing, to your last comment, that might be slow. I actually think in the slowness is the opportunity. Spending trillions of dollars takes a lot of time, but we do it in the wrong way. So capitalizing on that slowness for increasing those type of partnerships is going to be critical important. So thanks very much. Moving on to short interventions by Marion, Marwan, and Clément, starting with Marion Le Pomelec, the lead specialist for agriculture, natural resources, and rural development. Marion, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to stop my video to avoid any connection problem. I have to share my screen. Do you see my screen? Hello. Is it okay?
Yeah, we see.
Do you see my screen?
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay, I hope I don't. I think since I have some connection problem. Okay. Well, good afternoon. I'm Marion Le Pomelec, lead specialist in rural development at the Inter-American Development Bank. My pleasure to be with you today. For decades, the IDB has been financing investment in agricultural water management in several countries of our regions. And obviously, the form of our engagement has evolved a lot over time, based on many lessons learned and new challenges and new opportunities. Obviously, at the beginning and during many years, our investment exclusively irrigation sector, and it's well known that this exclusive generating perspective generates many problems in terms of because of many gaps, and I will mention some of them right now. More or less 10 years ago, with growing concerns related to the availability of the water resources and destruction of infrastructures because of natural disaster, the watershed approach was integrated into the irrigation project. Pardon. Sorry. And this generated new challenges, for example, conflicts between communities upstream and downstream, the watershed, or the need for interinstitutional coordination between public authorities in charge of irrigation and water management, respectively. But this led to recognition of the importance of the social and institutional dimensions in agricultural water management. And then recognizing that financing the conduction of water to the farm gate was not effective as expected, the bank started to finance private goods, and I mean bringing water to private plots. And this was also the opportunity to start promoting technified irrigation. But again, new approaches, new challenges, and among other, it really became obvious that those investments were not justified or are not justified without complementary actions in agricultural research, in technical assistance to farmer, access to market, and access to financial services. Throughout this evolution, the correct operation and maintenance of this collective system has been a recurrent issue with important consequences on efficiency, stability. And we promoted quite a lot the transfer of water and infrastructure management to water users, to farmers, and the strengthening of water users association. But however, to use really African, but in some contexts, this approach is not proved to be the most suitable. And now we really began to ask ourselves the question of the cultural relevance of this kind of intervention. While historically, cultural relevance is a concept that we were using previously only in the context of intervention involving indigenous people. More or less 15 years ago, our bank started being really concerned also with the issue of equity and social return on projects. Investment collective to exclude farmers who are not located in irrigated districts, and the cost per farmer of collective infrastructure can be very high. So, and this raises a complete cost issue. So therefore, with the idea of promoting a low-cost, high-impact model, the Afdb began financing more and more individual, small-scale, technified irrigation, mainly through voucher mechanism that includes social assistance to farmers. And to finish with, more recently, the bank has developed a growing interest in the management of green water and nature-based solutions for agricultural water management, in particular based on several experiences in Central America, especially in terms of soil management to enhance water infiltration, retention, avoid evaporation. We believe that upgraded rainwater based on the principle is very promising, but it is knowledge intensive. So, hello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was saying it's knowledge intensive, so it simplified that nothing new challenge of how to provide good quality and cost-effective technical assistance. To conclude, why did I decide to present the Afdb historical experience? It's because most of all those challenges remain totally valid, existent, and our concerns are primarily related to the efficiency of public spending, social return and inclusion, and climate change adaptation and environmental sustainability are also still completely valid. And in the current context, restriction resulted from the crisis, growing social needs and social expectation, and of course, climate change and global crisis. This objective of efficiency, inclusion, and sustainability appear even more relevant, and will continue to guide our actions in this area. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marion. Part of it, your connection was a little bit tough, but it was great to share your insight from moving the process with the bank through collective infrastructure, this watershed approach, as you said, with all the challenges it came, technifying and then finding the opportunities in the context of this cultural aspect where you tapped into indigenous knowledge and capacity to turn it around. And by taking a more social, inclusive approach, almost individually tailored approach, building up a type of enabling environment from a totally different perspective, also creating opportunities from that for investing. And then you move towards solutions that not only tick boxes in the context of agriculture and water, but all of a sudden across the full environmental scale. So a lot you brought in. Thanks very much. Next is Marwan Latki, Principal Irrigation Engineer at the African Development Bank. Please stick to your time, because we're running a little bit over. Marwan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. I'll go straight to the points. I would like to make a presentation on AFDB's engagement in agricultural water management in the past, the current engagement level, and what is being scheduled in the future. I will not go into the details, just to let people know that there's a wide variety of instruments that are being used to finance irrigation and drainage. In the past, the level of budgets for irrigation and drainage projects was quite low, circa $10 million per projects on concessional loans, on non-concessional loans, and 35 on concessional loans. Currently, for the active portfolio of AFDB in irrigation and drainage, we've been engaging circa $225 million on active portfolio solely for irrigation and drainage, compared to 1 billion for the past 50 years. So this is showing an important trend, greater investments compared to previous decades, especially through ADB loans, which are representing 90% in volume, but also a stronger focus on renewable energy for pumping, on water saving, and on smallholder farming. This is only for projects that are labeled as irrigation and drainage, but there's a whole bunch of projects that are agriculture and rural development projects that are including an irrigation components. And here, figures are much higher, of course. It's circa $12 billion for the ongoing portfolio, which show that there is a greater integration of irrigation and drainage investments into value chain projects. This is what we can see today, especially through multinational operations in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa. And here as well, we can see greater integration of investments on irrigation into food security and resilience projects, relying on regional approaches. I'll conclude to say a word on Burkina Faso later on. On the lending program, what we can see now is that future projects for the next 3 years on irrigation and drainage, mainly on Northern Africa, are focusing on water recycling, on energy, on water productivity, and on water savings. Also for regional projects, for multinational projects, it is now focusing still on value chain and food security, but more and more on land degradation neutrality and on climate change adaptation and mitigation, with a lot of climate finance being mobilized and strong support to climate investment arenas. Just to say a word on the upcoming new policy and strategy on water of AFDB. I will not go into the details, just to let you know that there are some strong new operational guidance, especially more focus on economic valuation, pricing, cost recovery, but also on recognizing the multi-purpose use of water. In terms of the strategy, again, I will not go into details, but just to keep in mind that there is now a strong pillar on water for energy, especially with respect to hydropower potential. And here is what is mostly of interest for us, the major orientations in terms of agricultural water management. It's still draft, the water policy has to be approved, but of course, stronger management of both supply and demand, more efficient and climate smart irrigation, but also to promote the use of non-conventional water resources, including recycling, agricultural runoff, treated wastewater reuse and storage, desalinization, interbasin transfer, rainwater harvesting, and grey water use. We have been conducting an evaluation of our past investments in irrigation and investment operations. And we have been launching last year in January 2020, this publication to take stock of what has been done and learn about the lessons from how the projects have been implemented. This is some few topics in that respect. I will conclude to say a word on one particular country that I think is of interest for our discussion, which is Burkina Faso, which is involving more and more funding in irrigation. And such countries like Burkina or all Sahelian countries are not only looking for increasing the economic and social return of irrigation, but now they are more and more investing to manage the risks. This is very important. They are managing the risks on the infrastructures in terms of operation and maintenance. They are managing the climate-related risks in terms of flood and droughts. They are managing the markets-related risks with the evolutions of prices, as we saw in the food crisis in 2008. They are now managing health-related crises with the COVID. They still need to invest in their human capital and keep training people to have assets in developing these sectors. And more, unfortunately, they are facing risks related to terrorism and displaced population. And I think this is also something we need to learn in the way we process our operations, is to learn how to be more adaptive in the way we process, in the way we are crafting financial instruments, in the way we are supporting those countries. I will stop here and I will welcome questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marwan. This overview of where the Afdb is heading, and it's great to learn more about your new water policy. Would really demand a full session. Second is that you're so much right in the development question. The risks are piling up and are all interrelated. So it's this compounding effect of risks that demands an everyday attention, and before you know it, the only thing you're doing is responding to crisis instead of preparing for future development, let alone increasing water security across agriculture. So thanks so much for sharing. Clément Ouedraogo, coordinator of the Regional Water Control Program and Permanent Interstate Committee for Drought Control in the Sahel. Also to you, the floor is yours, and keep it concise. Thank you. Clément.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rank. I think that everybody listen to me.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I apologize for not posting my video because I am far from my office and the connection is not very good here. So I try to to speak about some experience, sales experience in investment in water for agriculture. So first of all, I want to thank for inviting me to this meeting, and I want to apologize so that my English is not very good, but I try to show some key message I want to show in five minutes. Okay, so first I want to share with you some reminders because I think that it's important. I think that everybody knows these statistics. For example, less than 4% of arable land is irrigated in the Sahel. And I ask myself, the real challenge for us is maybe to, excuse me?
Yeah, we hear you.
The real challenge for us is maybe to ensure that this figure, which have been repeated for 30 years, are no longer repeated and bandaged by the future generation. I think that is the real challenge. So, what's the challenge what's the real challenge? The technical challenge. First, I have to move from rainfall agriculture to efficient irrigated agriculture. That's a big problem. Because if you see the statistic, you know that our agriculture rainfall our agriculture is mainly rainfall at 90%. So it is a big challenge to move from this irrigation to move toward efficient irrigation agriculture. So, second challenge I want to say that this challenge is faced for several weaknesses and constraints. Low involvement of private sector in investment. insufficient technical and institutional capacity. What we can do that in that? 3 points, excuse me, with 3 points. I have some problem with my 3 point is there in this challenge of investing in the Sahel in West Africa. I think that this challenge joins a global challenge which is how to feed 3 billion more people by 2030 and ensure for each a minimum nutritional need for the. That's a real challenge for me. So I want in this second picture to speak about, excuse me, try to.
Yeah. We still hear you.
Okay. Oh, I have some problems. Okay. I have to speak about opportunities. The opportunities is known. We know now there are several demand of agricultural products, especially rice. We have a large fund of range in this area. That's a big opportunity. And we have some initiative calling for financing. We have structuring initiative in this country. And I think that we have many opportunity to move very real investment in water for agriculture. I want to paraphrasing Professor Albert White, who told me that the Sahel suffer less from physical scarcity of water than from a structural scarcity. So the COVID came and aggravate the situation. And I read some report, and the report say that the decline of in poverty we observe in the 10 years past, that has been stopped by COVID-19. And we can see it very soon. Massive job lost in urban area, the decline of price of agricultural product, the closing of weekly market and sitting on transport and so on and so on. So COVID came and aggravate the situation. And the rural who buy like of infrastructure are often relocated to the cities and themselves without job in the city. And we have a possibility to come back on rural countries, on farms. So I think that COVID teaches us that about the importance of agricultural water and its development. It is today the real safety net of our population in the event of disaster such as COVID. It is clear that our countries cannot ensure to all an equivalent contribution to loss due to COVID, for example. So we have to develop the use of agricultural water because it is a remains and rest course and refuge in the event of disaster. That's a big message I want to tell. So now I move to
Clément, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you because of the time. We have to go to the discussion after your presentation.
Okay. So, I have how many minutes?
No, 0. Yeah.
0 minutes. Okay. Yeah. So I can move just for the small recommendation. Yeah. Please. So just one, ensure that water resources are able to support investment. Work on water productivity by making sustainable and efficient project solution to both technical, but not only technical. We have to work on institutional order. And finally, provide quality review of investment program document at the regional level. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Clément. I think also considering the time and looking at the questions you already answered in the chat. Thank you for that, speakers. There is an overarching question to this, and it is knowing that there's a real demand for change in the sector, in the mix of agriculture, water, and finance. Can we use the current COVID-19 recovery. The crisis at one, but the recovery as a driver for that change. And what are then the opportunities? Because we know it's crisis all over the place, but there's massive investments and recovery efforts. So before you know it, the trillions of dollars, euros, yen, or whatever currency we see is poured into the projects of the past, and we're just going to replicate our past mistakes and firm up the institutional mechanisms of yesterday. Instead of that, we use this moment as an opportunity for the transition we need. That's the question to the panel. And that includes both Ismail and Peter, who started from the beginning. Who wants to go first? Just speak. Ismail?
Let me start, and then other colleagues will complement. I think it's a very important aspect, and the green recovery measures can actually accelerate actions that are geared toward climate action, mainly in developing economies, and that will allow those instruments to pay attention to support the most vulnerable population during and after the pandemic, while building the long-term resilience with the ag sector.
Yes. Okay. And it's true, but then the question is, how can this start to work? Because we know there's an opportunity, but we continue to miss it. If we see the build-up pipeline of investments that are on the table where the current recovery efforts are going, they're definitely not going to the transition of the agriculture sector. So it really demands a totally different connection to that recovery effort. And as said, can you become part of the solution? Is the mix of the change in the agriculture sector the opportunity of driving sustainable development in the context of COVID recovery? Others? Peter, yeah.
So yeah, I think I spoke a bit to that already. That yeah. I mean, and this is old Milton Friedman, right? The ideas that lie around when a crisis occurs. But the what I like. I mean, yes, it is this point of showing the alternatives that may be out there, but also I think there is opportunity in the financing crisis, because business as usual doesn't continue even in that, right? So there is probably less appetite and more fiscal stress to do what we have been doing, and yes, there's a big risk that if we start pouring the money back, that we go back to the old ideas, but there are now opportunities to see where other forms of financing that have hitherto not been used, because there was we were on the drip feed of the same agricultural subsidies. Well, this is a hope more than we are there, as you say, right? We have a big risk of losing this opportunity, but by showing how this can be a more broad-based solution and how we can do it in practice, I think that's where we can take people along on that shift, which was long overdue anyway, right? So it is not a new thing. But and the other thing is, I think what COVID does is to bring the climate crisis a little bit closer to home, right? But that was already always there, that long threat from the future that we had to deal with, and now. With a bit of a shock, there's a bit of a wake-up call in our clients to say we have to finance things differently. Whether we get there, I mean, this requires all of us, right, to work on that. So that is work in progress, I would say.
Yeah, but the compelling question here is, knowing that there's this massive amount of investment opportunity in the context of COVID recovery, totally focused at of securing jobs and economies at every scale around the world. But the agriculture sector, in its collaboration with the water sector and the finance sector, can put on the table as compelling cases for the change so much needed. Because there are many needs coming from food security and agriculture that are actually not building up on this sustainable development we are actually seeking. So there is this competition between solutions from the past and the to be developed solutions for the future. And I think actually the slowness in the collaborative process is an opportunity, because spending trillions of dollars on stupid infrastructure takes as much time as spending the dollars on the processes and infrastructure that are actually going to make us more resilient and more sustainable. But here's the agriculture sector can really play a game-changing role if they find the opportunity for building the pipeline of opportunities together with the water and financial sector. Any comment from Marian, Marwan, or Clément?
Yeah,
Yes, Marian, floor is yours.
My comment, I will make my comment only about Central America, because it's a region. It's a region I work there, and I know this place. And the trends, what we see is that the governments, because of the fiscal restriction, are now requesting clear evidence of the effectiveness and efficiency of the solutions that we can offer, and before deciding to take a loan, to say it like that. And they are also very interested in investing in less public goods and more in direct support. For example, in the form of vouchers or bonus, let's say vouchers. So they can, through this kind of instruments, they can give a direct economical support to the farmers. So this is a kind of instrument that can promote individual small irrigation. There is no we don't feel any appetite for infrastructure, large-scale infrastructure, and it is the opportunity to promote technified irrigation. This is a trend I can share for Central America.
Very good. Thanks so much, Marian. And I like the example very much. It helps us understand better how things could work. Marwan, Clément, other.
Yes, Marwan speaking.
Yes.
Thanks for this question. Indeed, it has been a major concern for the AFDB. The responses that have been brought were very short-term responses at the beginning. What was interesting was to see that for many countries, especially Sahelian countries, they were considering irrigation as an answer to that crisis, in the sense that it would secure the production or even increase the production. But if irrigation is securing agriculture, the question is how to secure irrigation in the face of this crisis. Because basically what happened is that for developing infrastructures, the promoters were no longer able to execute the projects and to realize the infrastructure on the ground. Also, a lot of inputs and fertilizers coming from other countries were blocked at the border because borders were shut down due to this situation. So the immediate response on AFDB's side through a COVID response was to provide inputs for farmers in those countries that were in need, and also to enhance the dialogue with all the stakeholders in implementing those investment projects, to make sure that we do understand the constraints of operators and that we are able to provide appropriate response. So it was very operational and very short term.
Very good. Yeah. Thanks, Marwan. It's very helpful and insightful. Clément.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ernst. I want just to emphasize, I think that if you want to increase investment in water for irrigation, we have to prepare and to have a ready project to be implemented. That's very important. We have ready the ready program to be implemented. And I want to say also that efficient projects as solution for this challenge is not only technical, it's also institutional and financial mechanism. It's very important. And finally, I want to say that the knowledge, and somebody tell us yesterday, knowledge is very important to support investment. And I think that is not really included in the project for and for irrigation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Clément. We just gonna end this discussion not because it is not relevant nor interesting, but because time is up, as is often happening as part of this bigger debate. I want to thank you all for joining. There is a mini break until 2:15. Final remarks by me is that the change that is foreseen across technical, cultural, governance, policy, finance can be driven by the current situation. But it really is it can be. But what we see around the world, it's not happening. So we will need from the sectors that are actually making the change, being agriculture, finance, and water, these opportunities starting to float, building into change of policies, change of financing mechanisms, change of governance from the practices on the ground. I think we can take a lot of inspiration culturally, being it indigenous, being it regional, coming from watersheds in the projects as you explained, but then finding those opportunities, still are drops on a hot plate. Having now with the COVID recovery investments, making those opportunities, scale them up and replicate it so that the impact indeed becomes massive and a driver for that sustainable development change we need. So we trust on you in this partnership on driving the change so much needed. Thanks so much for highlighting not only the challenges you face across the regions and your sectors in the mix of water, finance, and agriculture, but also sharing some of these opportunities. I want to thank the OECD and the partners of this roundtable, World Water Council, FAO, and the World Bank. And I hand it over back to Kathleen. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Henk. Really appreciate that, and all of the speakers as well, to really get started in thinking about what is a very difficult issue and rapidly evolving. I think that discussion sets us up well for our last and final session of the roundtable. We'll take a quick break. In fact, we'll still maintain, we were just 5 minutes over, so I suggest we reconvene at 20 minutes after the hour. So we'll still have a 15-minute quick break. And then please do stay connected and join us for session 4, looking at mobilizing commercial finance. So see you in 15 minutes, and thanks again, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are going to wait another minute or so and get started at 20 past the hour. So thanks for your patience. All right, so welcome back, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with the fourth and final session of the Roundtable meeting. Thanks, everyone, for connecting today. And just a reminder that indeed we're interested in hearing your questions and comments. Please do put those in the chat. We'll be monitoring that, and also our speakers can reply to you in writing. Now, moving on into this last session, here we're going to explore the role of commercial finance as a complement to public finance as a way to scale up investment for sustainable water use in agriculture. And many of you, I think, have been connected for the discussions of yesterday and also the previous session, but I want to put this, just underscore a couple of points to put this discussion on commercial finance in context. And here, I think we've heard quite a lot over the course of the meeting about some very important messages, including that we don't want to just have a discussion around mobilizing more money for more investments, but a big part of the issues at stake really are about getting better investments and making sure we're not funding unsustainable investments. So I just want to put our discussion about mobilizing commercial finance in that context. Now, of course, we also know that, you know, existing flows, there's opportunities to better target those flows to make sure they're really resilient and sustainable. But we know that existing flows are not enough to really achieve the policy objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so there is tension here about using money better, but also getting more money targeted into the relevant investments. And so here we're going to take a deeper dive into that look of the role of commercial finance. And there's a lot of ways to do that, including using public funds and existing finance more strategically, including looking at risk mitigation instruments and through blended finance mechanisms to crowd in additional capital. And of course, this always requires ensuring that risk sharing is balanced among our commercial and private and public actors. So there's a number of different dimensions of this topic. And I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion, indeed, great speakers. And we're going to start off with a keynote presentation, really from the private financier's perspective on investing in sustainable agricultural water. And notably, hearing more about a specific example of a new blended finance fund, and hearing also some lessons, both positive and also challenges that have been encountered in setting up this fund. And so we're very honored to have Hans Loth, who is the Group Executive Vice President, Global Head of UN Environment Partnerships at Rabobank. And I'm going to invite him to go ahead and give his presentation. Hans, you have about 10 minutes before we move on to our panelists. Hans, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen, and thanks for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me well, Kathleen? Just a quick check.
Yes, absolutely. Please feel free to share your screen with your presentation when you're ready.
Well, thanks. Is it okay if I do it straight up without presentation?
Absolutely, absolutely. Always welcome.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I also realized preparing for today, ladies and gentlemen, that you've already been in this session for a day and a half at least, and gathered some knowledge, no doubt, on the theme already. The danger of being almost last in line together with my fellow panelists is that I replicate. So I will keep it relatively short and take you a little bit through the journey of Rabobank as one of the banks that tries to make its feet wet in food system transition. Because I think contextualizing the introduction, Kathleen, and thanks for kicking off. I think that's how we should look at this. We need to transition our food systems, and that is a multi-headed animal, if you will. So we need to look at more responsible consumption. We need to look at more responsible production, and we need to put it into perspective of supply chains. Food system transition is one of the key cornerstones of Rabobank's strategy. The strategy under the banner, Growing a Better World Together. When we look at food system transition, we take it into perspective of a climate agenda. More and more banks, luckily, are putting this into context of a climate agenda. There's no other way. We just need to, and we need to do it together and quickly. There are a few challenges that we came across embarking on this journey. We set out this journey together with UN Environment in 2017, where we announced to mobilize $1 billion in capital for farmers that are a key enabler for such food system transition. Again, not in isolation, but in context of the supply chain. And why Rabobank? Rabobank has been incorporated by farmers, so there's a lot of affinity with the sector. And when we look at farmers and when we look at food system transition, we're essentially asking a change in behavior. But how can we ask for a change in behavior if we do not provide the tools to such farmer? Because when we look at farmers, there are several groups, large, medium, small. Large farmers tend to not have access to long-term finance for innovation, which is a challenge, because if you want to transition to a more sustainable food production, you need time. And time is almost one-dimensionally the same as risk within a commercial bank setting. So that's a challenge for the larger farmers. For the medium and smaller farmers, access to finance as such is a challenge, especially when we talk systemic finance, because there's always the informal middle person, but probably charging too much. So if you would like to enable a transition of food systems, access to finance is key. And if that's not there, you need to remedy that. But in context of banks, that's not so easy, because if you look at smallholders, they are perceived to be high risk. They're difficult to model. So it's very difficult for a commercial bank to say from Monday to Tuesday, hey, I've got an interesting new target group that I would like to enable, do a better job, because the rules and regulations do not allow for that. Banks have to deal with a certain risk appetite, and that's imposed by the regulator. That's a big misunderstanding sometimes, that people think that commercial banks make their own choices on risk appetite, but this is heavily regulated. If you think about it, for a good reason, namely to protect all of our savings. But that's also a boundary. So it's sort of a boundary for that bank to venture into something new. And this is new. This is innovative finance. So what Rabobank set out to do in 2017 under leadership of Wiebe Dreyer is, okay, if we cannot do it by ourselves as a bank, we may need to put an additional entity next to the bank to make it work. So then we get to the topic of de-risking that Kathleen already mentioned, and no doubt has featured in your conference already. And to put it really simple, you have a fund next to the bank, you have the bank provides a loan to the farmer. The part of the loan that is above the risk appetite of the bank is de-risked by the fund. It's frankly speaking that easy. So to put it into simple numbers, a tenor of a normal loan would be, say, 7 years. Let's say for this transition to more sustainable food production, we need 10 years. So who's going to deal with those 3 years, the difference between 10 and 7? So in this case, that's a fund. And that fund, together with UN Environment, FMO, Dutch DFI, and IDH, an NGO, we set up in 2020, actually, because the journey took 2 years to get it in place. So last year we set it up. It was there. We locked in the funding with strong support of the Dutch government. And we're able to get going. The governance is in place. Everything is operationalized. So what you then in essence have is that blended finance. You literally have public capital, in this case, the Dutch government, but we will have more blended with private capital, not only Rabobank, because AGI3 is the name of the fund, is open architecture. So Rabobank started out this journey as a commercial bank, but we invite other banks to join. Otherwise, the impact at scale will be difficult. So there you have it. And what we encountered in that journey is indeed quite a few lessons. And maybe that would be interesting also for this group to discuss, rather than to stick to jargon and difficult banking themes. When we talk about the lack of capital, we need to get more capital. Where does it come from? Probably public capital, but also private capital. So we always talk about the public-private leverage. When private capital is to be deployed, looking at public is a challenge. The public capital windows take time. They have a different agenda. They primarily look at impact. And it's quite difficult for a commercial institution to find your way in the public capital space, to go to a government and say, listen, I want to support food transition, but for that I need public capital, I need blended capital. That's a counterintuitive ask, because the public capital will say, hey, but you make profit, why do you need public capital? So that's an understanding of each other's stakeholder and shareholder challenges and the business model that you operate in. And when you do food system transition, in essence, you're talking proof of concept. And for proof of concept, there's higher risk. And for that, you need public capital to de-risk. So the first challenge on raising capital was to get through that understanding. Why are you asking me, the public, for capital, whilst you seemingly, in the common perception of private capital, you have more than enough? But again, that's not really the case if you look at how we need to operate within our governance. So that's the fundraising side of blended finance. But then the asset side, there's common opinion that there's enough capital out there, but it lacks projects, right? For today, agricultural water or farmer finance. That is indeed a challenge, where the public capital needs to go on the ground to be deployed effectively, create that impact that you would like to see on an SDG level and also financial return. I think looking at many of these impact funds out there, AGI3, which we incorporated together with our partners, is slightly different in that we have an institutional relationship with other banks. So when we look at projects, we use the bankers as our ambassadors. The bankers talk on a daily basis to our client base within the supply chain, literally ranging from Unilever to Olam to Procter & Gamble, you name them. And they're all active in the supply chain. So there's already an ongoing strategic dialogue. To put another tool into that conversation, like blended finance, is far more easier than to come up with it in splendid isolation. So we have the benefit of those bankers globally that speak the local language, that have the local infrastructure of those banks, and have the local currency and the local culture. I think that's a unique value proposition that works and provides for a pipeline of projects. So let me take a little pause there on finance. So I think I took a little bit of a breeze through the challenges that we faced over the last few years on getting a fund in place, raising capital, and building our pipeline. We announced 2 deals end of last year, so we're pretty okay and comfortable in creating that impact at scale, and we will indeed invite other banks to join. For the discussion, maybe to add, is that it's not only about finance. We do need technical assistance. We do need the capacity building on the ground. We do need digitalization, maybe even fintech to reach where the client in the end is, SMEs, farmers. More and more, especially in COVID, it's about automation and localization. What we also need to consider is to simplify the transactions. Blended finance transactions take a long time. That's not okay because we are in a hurry, right? We don't have a lot of time to create that impact at scale and have a positive impact on climate. The key enabler is partnerships. You cannot do this alone. There's no bank, there's no corporate, there's no government that can do this alone. So wrapping up, probably conscious of me hitting the 10 minutes or over it, is yes, it's about finance as an enabler, but it's not enough. So we need each other, we need partnerships, and we need a few other hardcore enablers to make it work. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and see what the audience feels of it and the panelists and chip in, and where we could also learn from each other. Thank you. Back to you, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Hans. That was excellent, extremely clear exposition of your experience so far with this blended fund. I think a couple of points really jumped out for me, including the fact that, of course, farmers are a key enabler, as is finance, but also this notion of needing time for the transition. So we can't overlook the fact that, you know, getting the right finance to the right farmers also can require some creativity on the part of blended funds. So looking for ways to extend the tenors of loans, allowing that time for transition, looking for ways to de-risking, investments and bringing other partners on board. Notably, I think it would be interesting to hear more in the discussion about how you got other banks also to jump on board, and also how you've also convinced some of the public actors, governments, of the need for these blended funds. So that's really interesting. We're going to go ahead and move over to the panel discussion. Invite our panelists to give their interventions first. Then we'll have time for questions after that. So I'd like to turn to our first panelist, Art Mulder, who is fund manager for the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development at FMO, another important Dutch financing institution there. And we know that the DFCD is building some interesting experience. So very interested to hear from you, Art, about what you've done so far and what you're looking at in terms of opportunities and challenges. Art, I think you have a couple of slides to share as well to support your intervention. So please go ahead and share your screen now, and I turn the floor over to you. You've got 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Hopefully you can see my screen now. One moment, please. And indeed, Hans did a fantastic story without any slides. I will try to do with a couple of them. Well, in a nutshell, indeed, you already introduced DFCD, Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. It's a kind of a blended vehicle, and it's also a little bit linked to the story of Hans Loth. Blended finance is, of course, very relevant if you talk about mobilizing also a capital from commercial investors. The Dutch Fund for Climate Development was an initiative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 160 million fund, and that was awarded to a consortium of partners, including FMO. My name is Art Mulder from FMO, and FMO is a leading partner in this initiative, and I'm responsible on behalf of FMO for this fund. This fund is about climate, about adaptation, and about mitigation. And I do not want to dig too much into the details, but just give in a nutshell a couple of things. But I try to go to, oh, here we see the next slide. I think the key message I would like to provide, there's lots of talking have been, I think, I assume so, just like Hans, about de-risking, about blended finance, how to mobilize money. Indeed, you cannot do it alone, what Hans said. You need to have blended finance for longer tenors. Kathleen, indeed, that's for completely sure. The message I would like to provide is that indeed you cannot do it alone. You need to do it with partners, but you need to do it in a structured way with partners. And actually partnerships in a structured way together with the right product at the right time and together with the right blended element in such a project can make it a success, we think so. And the DFCD is an example of that. If you look at this slide, then indeed we try to avoid the so-called valley of death, what you often see in a lot of projects with good intentions, a lot of grant money, and suddenly when it really comes into the investment side, it drops death. Now, via this kind of fund structure, we integrate grant funding with long-term finance solutions. And it's very important that you look first in the initial stage, you need grant funding for the development, but later on, you need long-term finance also with the grant element, indeed longer tenors, indeed relatively lower interest rate compared to the risk. So every time again, look at the product and look at the percentage of blended funding needed. But then also you need the right partners already mentioned. The issue is that everybody talks about you need projects and you also need partners. But what often I think what is the case is that these partnerships are not realized in a structured way. And in this Dutch Fund for Climate Development structure, we really have a consortium that's working on these projects from initial stage, mitigation or adaptation climate projects, but going forward also to later stages, long-term finance solution. And every partner, based on the whole corporate governance structure, on the whole structure of documentation, has its own role. So the origination facility, which is the initial stage, WWF, a very extremely well-known NGO, of course, takes care of the climate-related risks. So they de-risk it from a climate perspective. Well, SMV, another consortium partner, looks purely at the community side and at the social side. And together, these partners try to develop from a landscape projects that come either to FMO, who provides a solution on related to land, so it can be agri-related, forestry-related, ecological systems, or it goes to climate fund managers who look more at the water side. And if you have these partners and you have done them in a structured way, and if you have a blended finance on board, then indeed these partners, each for their own role, need to build up a structure where you can also catalyze extra funding. And this is the short example of the water facility. So climate fund manager takes care of the water facility, and what they actually do is they attract a lot of extra money linked to the story of Hans, where you have first a layer of capital from the governments, then you get a layer of a little bit more, less risk appetite from commercial investors, and the last layer will be the less risky part for the major part of commercial investors. By layering such a structure, you get the right projects on board, but only talking about financial whiskets with all kinds of tier capitals doesn't work. First, you need to have an embedded structure of the right partners in place in order, indeed, it was flagged by Hans, to really get the right projects, not only the right funding structure, but the right projects. Well, if you do it in such a way, then you can do quite sexy and even extremely relevant projects that are in advance foreseen to be not viable. This is an example of Kelp Blue in Namibia, a very large project that actually was awarded with one of the 11 most innovative projects by the World Economic Forum. It's about kelp, it's about seaweed, kind of forest that can go up to 26 meters below sea level, and it creates a huge storage of carbon, but at the same time also enables to bring back biodiversity and to have an end project to the market that doesn't involve any extra land, which is of course very scarce. Now, a similar example, you could talk about mangroves, where we're working in Bangladesh on a project where we try to look at sustainable agriculture, but at the same time protecting mangroves. And I think everybody knows how extremely important mangroves are from an environmental perspective, for storage, but also for biodiversity underwater, for protecting land against all kinds of natural disasters. And again, if you have the right projects, the right blending percentage, and then also in a structured way, these partnerships, then actually we have all the elements in place to do these kind of climate-related projects as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Art, and a very interesting presentation. In fact, a lot of common points, I would say, to Hans's intervention there. Indeed, looking at this structuring, the partnerships, also looking at ways to drive that pipeline of projects through the origination facility, which seems to be a fundamental element of the DFCD approach. And notably, of course, you talk about the need for partners and projects, and there's a need for more projects, but also good projects. And I think, when we get to the discussion, I'd like to hear more about how you identify those good projects, how you do the risk assessment, what are the factors in the enabling environment that need to be there in order to make those deals happen. We also have a lot of questions coming through in the chat, so that's excellent, and we'll get to those soon. But I'd like to now invite Chris Hartley to give his brief presentation. He is a senior environmental markets analyst at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Chris, I suppose it's early in the morning where you are. Thank you for joining us. You're going to give us a bit of experience from the U.S. side on innovative financing mechanisms, combining multiple benefits as well. So you have 5 minutes. I don't think you have any slides. Chris? Okay, hi, I see you there. Great. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My comments will provide a brief synthesis of my observations working with both the public, philanthropic, and private sector stakeholders in agriculture and market-based approaches to conservation, including water finance and water markets in the United States. Typically, when we hear about blended finance, it's because we have failed markets. When I look at blended finance, I see more of an opportunity for additional public good. If you look at the United States currently, our water resources are largely oversubscribed, and the underlying infrastructure needs significant investment. Currently, public spending on water supply, storage, and wastewater treatment accounts for about $140 billion per year. And that's nowhere near enough. Additional funding is needed. The most appropriate source for that funding really depends on whether you view water as a public or private good. Typically, when looking from a government perspective, it's a public good with private aspects. And that, if you think about the UN's perspective, really water is a basic human right. We also issue licenses for its use and can restrict its use. So it gets somewhat complicated. So as I mentioned, in many cases, water really is both. However, there's often a failure to identify the full scope of the benefits and the costs associated with water and water finance. Both positive and negative externalities really are driving these transactions. When I think about investments in water, I'm looking for 3 different types of returns. The first are the financial returns, which people are most comfortable with. They can pencil it out on a piece of paper. They can look at a spreadsheet and say an investment of $1 billion is going to lead a 14% return. That's beautiful. However, looking at it from a public perspective, a financial return in and of itself is not enough. It also has to have social and environmental returns. And that multiple benefit aspect really is the reason that I think water and water finance is very well suited to blended finance, because it does offer a combination of the financial, social, and environmental returns possible. Currently, federal investments in agricultural water in our major agricultural regions are roughly evenly distributed between water infrastructure, water and land stewardship, and then emergency response, particularly in response to drought or flood for that matter. It's important to remember that water really is not the same. The source of that water, the timing of its availability, the quality of the water, and the location matter. I was checking water prices not long ago, and I could, within a 500-mile stretch, so 700 plus kilometers, I could find water prices differing from 1 cent per cubic meter up to about $2 per cubic meter. That's not a long distance for that huge difference in price. And what you come to see very quickly is that the urban users are definitely willing to pay more for that water, and they typically do not have the senior water rights. So you create an immediate friction between agricultural water and urban and peri-urban water. What you start to find out is that water on the margin is often worth more, not only in the urban agricultural juncture, but also looking within agriculture. So those farmers that are able to farm, but could farm better or more assuredly with a little bit more water, are willing to pay more for that little bit more water. So as a public sector entity, really water policy, I think, helps drive those investments. As a policymaker, what we need to do is to continue to provide transparency. So letting people not only know what the water availability is, but what the risks are. Providing clear water tenure, and then helping to manage risk. Within the Department of Agriculture, we have several different programs that allow us to do that. Particularly in the past 5 to 10 years, we've increased our ability to provide crop insurance for irrigated crops. So that if your ability to produce is impacted by an inavailability of water because your irrigation deliveries did not occur because of drought or because of infrastructure problems, we can help mitigate that risk. And that is a good public investment. We also provide loan guarantees for a lot of that investment and are often the lender of last resort. So if commercial finance will not take the risk, the federal government will in some instances. And we provide a significant amount of technical support. What that means for us is that we're really helping to create a stronger agricultural sector and the ability for that private sector finance to come in. I think the other piece, which is somewhat unique to the US and more developed areas, is we have a luxury of robust data and largely working capital markets. As much as we can extend that data availability to other sectors or other regions, I think we have an opportunity to increase additional private investment in developing areas as well. The biggest hurdles I've seen to developments in agricultural water really are transaction costs, both for metering, but also for delivery. And then there's a significant amount of resource competition. So it's not only agricultural water we're looking at, but basic wash needs as well. And if you're trying to prioritize food availability versus health, sanitation, and hygiene, where do you draw that line? Where does that money come from? And in a lot of instances, the wash investments can be covered by government intervention, whereas many of the private sector agricultural investments are not. And that's because it is seen as, the beneficiary should pay. Well, in many of these instances, the benefits are not strictly limited to a single provider or single producer. They stretch across the entirety of the economy. They stretch throughout the development cycle. And that's quite important to remember. And then finally, as has been mentioned repeatedly, the increased frequency of extreme weather events has been extremely problematic. And trying to de-risk that is very difficult. There are a couple ways that can be done, both with technology and with additional finance mechanisms. The one that I think I'm probably most intrigued with at the moment is really looking at adjusting crop insurance premiums to reflect soil water holding capacity. It creates an incentive for additional carbon sequestration, but it also provides a greater buffer to insufficient water allocation. So I see a lot of opportunity there, both in terms of addressing climate change, but also for helping to restore agricultural certainty. I see a lot of opportunity for payment for performance. So it's not enough just to provide the money, but rather we'll provide you more money if you can show me better results. In a developing world context, I think that there's opportunity there as well, but I do believe we need to meet the basic needs first. I think additional public investments really are good for being leveraged through public-private partnerships, several of which we've heard about already. And then finally, I do see an opportunity for increased agricultural capability or viability through green labeling or premiums for improved water stewardship. Looking at the US in particular, there's a market for that, and there's a real appetite to have it done. So I'll stop there for now, but I'm happy to answer questions later during our question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Chris. I mean, you highlighted a number of really excellent points. And I liked, in fact, how you started out saying blended finance is not just about fixing a market failure, but also looking for where there's opportunities to deliver additional public goods and benefits. I think that's a very important point to highlight, and looking for this mix of returns, financial returns, but also social and environmental returns, which makes water attractive. And indeed, I think your overview of some of the key elements of what we call the enabling environment for investment, so those policies and those institutional arrangements, including water prices, including water allocation, clarity around allocation, abstraction rights, tenure, robust data, very important. And also on the financial side, having deep capital markets, of course, are very conducive to making these models emerge. So it'll be interesting also to hear from you a little bit more about, to what extent some of that experience in the US could be translated or not to other countries where you might not have as robust data, perhaps less developed capital markets, et cetera. So those are some food for thought, but you gave us a number of themes to talk about. But before we move to that discussion, I'd like to invite our third and final panel speaker, Richard Kolbach, who is an industry specialist in agricultural water from the International Finance Corporation, the IFC. And he has a wealth of experience to share with us. And I think, Richard, you have a couple of slides to support your intervention. You have about 5 minutes, and then we're going to move to the discussion. Okay, great. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. I'd like to build a little bit on the previous speakers that you've heard. I have the pleasure of going last. I'm your last panelist today, and so we're going to open up the Q&A session just after I finish, and we have a summary. But we've heard some really interesting things around blended finance, and from Art, we've heard his perspective. We've heard a little about the infamous valley of death, which is something that we are very afraid of ourselves at IFC. We've heard a little bit from Chris around data and policies. I'd like to really introduce two main things that we feel at IFC are missing in scaling up and supporting the private sector in going into the financing of irrigation. As you know, at IFC, we have a blend of different approaches. We bring in the finance, we bring in the advisory side, technical support, but we've more recently gone into creating markets as well. Historically, we've been demand driven. So a client will come to us and will ask for an investment in a particular project. We assess that project and we move forward and we might provide them with advisory. But we've realized that we're not moving fast enough and big enough. We're not having these large scale impacts that we need. And so this creating markets approach has come out. And so I'd like to spend a little bit of time maybe today talking about the creating markets side of things, where we're going for large scale, where we're trying to drive the private sector into more investments in the area. And for us, the private sector really is driven by a couple of things. It's risk averse, we know that, and it really wants to know what the structure and the predictability will be before it gets into an investment. And there's a number of different actors in this, and we can debate which elements should be where, but essentially speaking, the farmer is at the center. The farmer is going to be using the irrigation system, make no doubt about it. But they're influenced and they're supported, or they're held back by government, by private sector, and by donors. And these should be really resources that the farmer can leverage. We've heard a little bit from our colleagues at the World Bank about farmer-led irrigation, which is really a theme we're trying to promote and support. And so the work of Peter on that and the work of his team is really key to this. But this predictability, this structure is really important. So there are two things I want to talk about. One is the need to coordinate this triangle, this grouping, this mapping. If government has one strategy to irrigation, donors have another, and the private sector has a third, the farmer will just arbitrage between them. And you won't really get a large scale impact. Certainly donors will have impact in their project. They'll report results. The private sector will chug along and make its profits, because that's what it does. And the government will report back out to the voters that they've achieved all the targets they set out to achieve. But you really won't see a massive uptake in irrigation. And we've seen this in several different countries. And I want to give you a couple of examples where there's a difference of approach. And that's okay. Every country will have a difference of approach, but there should be some sort of guidelines towards how finance is structured, the blending of finance, the component to go towards donors or subsidies, the component to go towards the farmer's contribution, the component towards the private sector is important. And within the private sector, we do consider agribusiness, large agribusiness, financial institutions that can provide the funding, and technology providers who can also provide technology and funding. Within Rwanda, the government is very, very strong. And so we've seen a lot of their control around where the projects come in. But we're now at the stage where we're moving away from this risk share, and forgive me, I'm moving my screen around a bit, this risk share between DFIs, public sector, private sector, and financial institutions, where the farmers really didn't participate heavily in the projects that we worked on, to a more of a national level plan, where IFAD, for example, in one of their projects, government of Rwanda, equipment providers, financial institutions, and farmers are all participating. But there is still a lot of competition in Rwanda, a lot of different models out there, and no coherence. And so there's at times conflict between the models and not a great deal of efficiency. Oops, too fast. In Uganda, we have an example where the bank has actually split it, and they've said, let's take an approach that's public sector finance, and one where there's public sector but put through the private sector. And so we have the opportunity to compare and contrast and maybe come up with some guidelines that might be based on some experience. But the risk here is being shared between the farmers, the public, and the private sector. So there's a better balance of risk. Key players in this project that we're working on: government of Uganda, World Bank, financial institutions, and value chain actors. So everyone playing a role in this. Finally, because I have a limited amount of time, Senegal, a cooperative scheme where the risk is being taken purely by the technology provider. The farmer doesn't want to take risk, the government doesn't want to take risk, and the banks, frankly, don't want to take a lot of risk either. So we see very, very different models. None of them perfect, none of them necessary, but at least some coherence at a national level should be starting to emerge. The final thing that I would say, and this is more to set up the questions, is that there are huge gaps in data. And we heard a little bit of this from Chris in the comments that he made. If you don't know where irrigation has been installed, if you don't know what different terms and conditions exist for loans around the country, if you don't know what types of equipment have currently been installed in use or have failed, if you don't know what the ROIs are, or whether there's been sustainable use, and you come in and try and build this from scratch, you're wasting an enormous amount of time, effort, energy, and money. And so it would be useful to have a third-party database at some stage, even in one country, that enables you to be able to look at this and bring in some structure, some predictability, and some ability for the private sector to move in and say, we know where we can focus. We know that there's going to be some longevity of this infrastructure, of this ecosystem, and we can come in and invest in it. Because with competition comes a great deal of waste. So I'll stop there because I've gone over a little bit of time. Thanks very much. I look forward to the Q&A.
Richard, thanks so much. I mean, obviously a wealth of experience there, and you did very well to give us a lot of food for thought very, very quickly. I certainly appreciated your points around this notion of IFC moving more into creating markets themselves. So this upstream activity, I think, is very interesting and also chimes well with the efforts of the DFCD to develop their origination facility. So really, those financiers are also developing their own pipeline. I think that's also a bit what we heard from Rabobank. I think your notion of it, from what I take as well from your presentation, is there's this diversity of financing models. So there's a lot of different ways to allocate risks among a variety of different partners. And the examples from Uganda and Senegal do illustrate that quite well. And I'm quite intrigued by your idea of this need for potential guidelines for how to structure this finance. So thinking about what models work for which contexts and which types of investments. So it'd be good to dig into that during the discussion. Now we've got about 30 minutes to discuss, so we're not in a rush for time. So I hope we can have a couple of passes through in terms of questions to our panelists. And I see the chat is very active. I'm trying to pull a number of different elements from questions from various people to allow our panelists to react. And so what I think I'll do is pose a couple of questions to all of you, and then we can go through in turn, and you can respond and give us further insights around those questions based on your experience. And so the three questions I'd like to start with is, one is around this whole idea of how you find good projects. So we're hearing, of course, that the pipeline of projects is a major issue. It can be a major bottleneck. So how do you identify good projects? What are you looking for? How do you assess the risk of those projects? Maybe even things that are red flags that make you avoid certain projects in certain places. So that's one, is what you're looking for in terms of good projects. Two, I think we heard from everyone around transaction costs. Blended finance has some benefits. We know it's transaction cost heavy. All of this cooperation, finding your own projects, this is also heavy. So what can be done to keep those transaction costs low? And then the third question in this round, I'll put to you, is around monitoring for benefits. So how to make sure those projects are actually delivering those benefits? How do you monitor that? I think it was Chris who mentioned pay for performance, et cetera, et cetera. How can those elements be used to making sure that that finance is really being used and delivering what's expected? So those are three elements, food for thought for all of our panelists. And I'd like actually to turn back to Hans first, and then we'll go to Art, Chris, and Richard. Hans?
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. I would need some help on the second question because I got distracted. So I have the first and the third, but let me start with the first and the third then. Yeah, the pipeline is indeed the sort of magic nugget out there that everybody talks about. What we learned, and I'll put ourselves in a humble position. When we started out our journey with AGI3, we thought that blended finance is a well-defined topic out there, and that clients have a well-defined blended finance need on the shelf. That is not the case. Blended finance as such lacks awareness across the board. Maybe today we're in a group of friends that knows quite well what it is. But often you find that you need to explain in mainstream commercial banking, what blended finance really is, how it works, and how it can help. Also, it's slightly more complicated than your average loan because you're not seeking only a return, but you're seeking, more importantly, frankly speaking, you're seeking impact. And that's new for commercial banks. It's sympathetic and everybody wants it, but how do you do it? And how do you weave that into your loan? Easily making that connection with your third question, how do you monitor impact? For Agri3, that's fairly simple in the sense that that is with the fund. They have their own fiduciary duty to report on that project by project. We developed a framework for SDG impact together with UN Environment, who obviously know much more about it than we do as a bank. So with that framework and the fund management, Valtelia, who have ample experience with this, that's embedded into their way of working, and it's audited upon, so it's independent from what we do as a bank. Then maybe you can help me with your second question.
Yeah, that's about transaction costs. So how to keep those low if possible.
Yeah, well, that was a great point by one of the fellow panelists. Complexity of transactions and transaction costs is a huge disenabler for the last mile with the farmer on the ground. There, I truly believe that there may be a role well beyond commercial banks, but more for fintech and teaming up with fintech and digital. Traditional banks tend to not be the expert on that theme. So this goes to my point that we shouldn't be too pretentious in thinking that money will solve all challenges, because it won't. So you really need to partner up with, in this case, fintech, to monitor that and keep the transaction costs low. Blockchain is an excellent example. How to do it and how to do that at scale is somewhat in transition, I believe, still, but I'm also looking for fellow panelists' input there, because we didn't find an across-the-board solution for blockchain transaction cost at scale. It still requires a lot of manual input, if you will. Back to you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Hans. Thanks for elaborating on those 3 points. I'd like to hand over to Art to hear your views as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I will try to be, in addition to the good remarks of Hans in my reply. First of all, the red flag, if you look at the solution we have, is indeed, we look already at initial project, but the first question we ask is who's exactly the leading party? Who will be the kind of sponsor who will be long-term committed, not only by financial attribution, and it can be a sponsor that we need to structure, like a corporation or a special vehicle or a microfinance institution. But the first thing to realize is we really need to work on, have in mind already what will be the final party who also will be committed to stay long-term in such a project, such an enterprise. Often project will simply not be realized because there's a lot of consultancy ideas spent in the early stage, and then it goes to nothing. So I think that's really the crucial thing. If you want to increase the success factor, just first ask this question, the structure and the leading party for the long term to start this. Secondly, on the transaction costs, I really appreciate also what Hans said on the fintech side. On the other hand, I think that's extremely important, and it's searching for all of us to find the right partners in the right countries there. In addition, I think it's good to realize for all financial vehicles to see if the cost component are particularly made locally, because there are so many structures where actually the actual work is being done outside the country themselves, which will boost the cost structure intensively. It's not good for the world, it's not good for the local country, because it has less alignment, but also it's not good for the cost structure to be competitive. So we are extremely enthusiastic about proposals that are particularly linked locally and structured locally with the local people as much as possible on all kind of levels in the project. And the last thing about impact indicators, my answer to this would be, if you really want to have monitoring impact properly, define a couple of key indicators. We have as key indicators CO2, and it can be CO2 captured or avoided or reduced, but it can. So CO2 is one. The second one is sustainably managed agriculture hectares, and the third one is the number of beneficiaries. So hectares, beneficiaries, CO2. And then there are all kind of layers of complexity below that. That's for sure. But I think you need to have some key things to steer on that the outside world understands, and then the complicated layers you need to actually organize extremely well. Otherwise, you will drown anyway. But if you have this simplified structure, you can also actually monitor them properly.
Yeah, great points, Art, and actually very practical considerations around, looking for that lead structure, but also with regard to the KPIs, or keeping it simple, sounds like also good for communication, even though these topics can become very complex very quickly. Chris, how about from your point of view on these three elements? Looking forward to hearing more.
Very good. In terms of good projects, I'm going to defer a little bit and say that good partners really help find us those good projects. Particularly being in the public sector, there's no shortage of folks bringing forward good projects. Difficulty we have is being able to sort through them to figure out which are the best projects and which are the most likely to succeed. That's not easy. And it definitely takes both experience on the ground, but also continued involvement in the sector, because it's continually growing and evolving and changing. When I look at transaction costs, my default response to how to keep them low, let the government do it. The problem with that is it really can inhibit free enterprise, and that's a problem, or can be. I believe as we have more information about these markets and these sectors, we'll have a lower risk perception and we'll increase our transaction volumes. As we increase transaction volumes, those costs should come down, but it's getting those first over the finish line that are the problem. And we're in that step right now. And then finally, looking for those impact indicators, I'd really have to split it up between biophysical versus social versus financial. Of those, I think the financial are probably some of the easiest. The biophysical are getting better as our technology is getting better, and we know what it is that we're looking for, whether you're looking at CO2 or you're looking at calories produced per drop of water, all of that's viable. The social, I think, is far more difficult, both because of the time horizon that we're looking at. We're making investments today, but the social impacts will likely not be seen for years. So how do we go to that next phase of financing? How do we move forward? How do we make certain that we're not, I'm going to say, overemphasizing financial or biophysical returns at the cost of human interests? And that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I mean, that's actually very interesting, pointing out that, in fact, the different indicators in terms of performance have very different time horizons, and that's not the longer time horizon is not always amenable to some of the financial actors in the market. Now I'd like to hear from Richard. If you can elaborate on those 3 points, interested to hear what you have to say.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to take a slightly different approach maybe on some of the answers that I gave in terms of finding projects in the pipeline. Traditionally we have a decent deal flow coming through, but I mentioned before our creating markets and our upstream approach, and that's really driving towards going into riskier markets, going into areas where there's conflict, there's violence, or there's financial risk, and trying to incent the private sector to do that. And if you're the private sector, you're there, you have a role to play, you can't step away from it, but trying to bring a private sector sponsor who has options to go to secure markets and bring them into those risky markets is a great deal more difficult. And so to get large scale impact when you're going into post-conflict Yemen, for example, you need to be able to give a lot of support. And that's what's really pushed us into this upstream piece. Mainstream is relatively straightforward. We're not concerned about that, but finding good projects in countries that are struggling and doing it at scale is really a challenge. And so we've launched a whole new approach to that. I can go into that a little bit more in detail at another time. In terms of transaction costs, Chris and I are on the same page there. It's really around data, it's around transparency. Every single time we go into a deal, if we have to go in and do extensive due diligence, the transaction costs are horrific. And so if we could get better data, if we could share data with partners, if we could have information and a predictability in the market, at least in some markets, of what others are doing, that would really help us. because that data is incredibly expensive and it takes a lot of time to generate. Finally, on the monitoring for benefits, I'm going to take a totally different approach, because you've heard really good answers from Art and from Chris and so forth. So I'm going to talk about monitoring for benefits with the virus in the room, COVID-19, and the challenges that puts out. And what that's forced us to do is look at how we do it, not what we monitor for, because that hasn't changed substantially. If you're dealing with agriculture, there are some metrics that everyone's going to use, one form or another. But we're now looking at how do we look at things at scale and at a distance. And so a lot more of our focus around the monitoring is around the tools, use of GIS, use of satellite images, use of 360 images and virtual reality. How do we get in there without getting in there? How do we look at the field without going to the field? How do we get to all parts of a project without getting to any of the parts of a project? And so we're really looking at doing this at a distance, but doing it effectively. And so we may end up at the end of this in a very good position of being able to use a new set of tools to monitor and see the benefits and the impacts. And particularly over time, as we've heard, you can't keep going back and doing studies and baseline studies and endline studies and a whole range of studies, because that's incredibly expensive. And once the project is ended, the incentives to continue to follow it drop off rapidly. But if you can do this almost in an automated fashion with artificial intelligence linked to satellite images, and you can see things, because we're working in agriculture in the field, you can see infrastructures being installed, you can see it still being operated, you can see it still having an impact versus control areas. You have a way of doing monitoring for benefits that is much more sustainable and much more scalable.
Thank you, Richard. I mean, that's quite fascinating to think about some of the opportunities that new developments in terms of technology, new market developments, new data could potentially bring. Sounds like it could be game-changing, but I'd be interested actually to hear more from our panelists about how you see things moving forward in the future. And we have time for another round of second round of questions, I think, before we move into wrapping this session up. And I'd like to focus that second round of questions for our panelists really on where they see the key points, the key sort of drivers of accelerating action in this area and scale. And I think we've heard some elements in terms of opportunities for standardization, potentially new guidelines, broader use of data and technology, fintech, blockchain, etc. We've heard a lot of different elements. We also could mention that there's this growing interest from investors and financiers in the market in ESG, environmental, social, and governance type of products. So with all of these, I would say, newer developments on the horizon, one of our participants in the chat mentioned also this new development with regard to futures market for trading water futures, which has just started, water futures in California, which has just started. So with all of these new developments, I'd like to hear from our panelists, where do you think really are the one or two key elements that you think are going to be responsible for driving the most transformational change? We always talk about scale, we talk about the need to accelerate, but often that takes time and it does take a lot of investment. So where do you think where do you see the biggest opportunities emerging? And I'd like to start with Hans, if you could look into your crystal ball and give us your vision on that.
Well, you're lucky because I happen to have a glass ball. So if I need to make a choice between the topics that we mentioned, and nobody's wrong, and frankly speaking, we need all of the above, but I would tend to agree on data. But maybe I can flip it around, because what I see, what we see, is that there's not a uniform global database yet, right? I think we can conclude that, and there might even be a need for that. What we may need to ask ourselves, because it's key for SDG management, it's key for risk assessment, it's an obvious one. Why is it not reaching the scale that it may need? So that could be a question that I would like to share with my fellow panelists. A few additional thoughts to trigger the thinking. And I haven't thought this through, and this is by far not academic, but what we see sometimes is that one magic bullet globally may not be feasible for many, many reasons. So what we could consider to do, or it's happening probably already, specifically in India, to look at local solutions, country solutions, roping in youth, because the youth tends to be more into technology, and roping in local knowledge, which is key, building on Art's point on local currency, but also local knowledge, looking at private equity, startups, because a lot of good stuff is happening there. And that's just another world, but just reaching out and bringing these guys into this conversation might help. So maybe a country by country approach, pending the one global magic bullet. And I think what we would need, but that's a question that I also like to throw out there. Do we need more uniformity in standards, or can we motor on with what we have? Because sometimes people use this, I'm being blunt here, as an excuse to not go into big data. They say, well, we need uniform standards first. So a few observations and a few questions, maybe also to make myself humble and ask the fellow panelists for their feedback.
Je veux m'assurer deux choses là. Oui, bien sûr. La première, c'est plus général. Tout qui est écrit là, la source de tout ça, c'est qui ou d'où?
So we hear you, Philip, speak, but in French. I'm not sure if you mean to ask a question or not. But Hans, you gave us some good responses, but also some provocative questions. So I'm going to ask Art actually to jump in. We can go in the same order again, sharing your thoughts around, where are you seeing the main drivers of taking this forward, and maybe also reflecting on some of Hans's points as well.
Yeah, thank you. And also interesting, Hans, indeed, you ask humbly the other panelists as well. But at the same time, I think you have a brilliant idea to look far more on the local side and on youth and on the technical side to change the world on a country by country basis. And so I fully would align that. Just think out loudly what it might also match to the idea I have. And that's actually not my own idea. It's also linked to the recently announced report, Mobilizing Institutional Investor Capital from the OECD. And there you see the dilemma. Actually, the big, you need a link between local and the big money flows. And the huge money flows are in the pension funds, the insurance companies, Commonwealth, and they simply do not invest in what we try to achieve for a better world. So how can you link these two together? And that's fantastic, a very inspiring discussion actually to link it also to your local ideas. I think if you look at the multilateral development banks, you have on one side the governments, then you have the multilateral development banks, and then you have more the pension funds who are less risk adverse. So indeed, these institutions should play a role, but that comes also a little bit to a point I earlier made, to really have with local partners or local feet on the ground, to start developing projects in a local site, including involving the youth, including all these tech parties, but really in order to convince these huge institutions that actually it's not as risky as they think. De-risk it, but also convince them that the risk appetite they have is in line with the good investment in the local country, as long as you structure it properly. So the missing link is actually the structured approach of partnerships who also are locally involved. And and I think partnership is a little bit a kind of term that is used too often. But if you really structure it properly in a structure with the right finance on board, with the right blending mix, and also the right products, and you do that with partners being available locally, including all these, maybe on the country by country side, what Hans said, then hopefully you bridge the gap towards the real money, which is these institutional investors. And I really like the report on OECD there. One remark from my side on that report is there's only one a little bit conservative thing they mentioned, is that they said, listen, the most difficult countries actually these are too difficult. So you also need to look at your credit rating as multilateral development bank, etc. And I would like to put on the floor that actually the countries are never too difficult. You just need an extra layer of concessional funding, of government funding, to realize also these different countries. But it would be really extremely a waste of all the efforts if these difficult countries are neglected based on all kinds of criteria regarding bankers regulation or regarding credit ratings. I think the partnerships, the products and the blending mix would be sufficient already to also tackle these difficult countries with the youth and with the local partners on board.
Thank you, Art. And indeed, the report you're referring to was launched just last year based on a database put together by our OECD colleagues, which showed financing flows from placements of institutional investors in green or sustainable investments. And in fact, one of the takeaways for water, from the water perspective, is in fact, there's a very, water accounts for a very small share of those allocations. So I think you make a very good point about, how do we connect these potentially very large sources of capital with projects that are originated, that are innovative, that are originated in very local contexts, how to make the match there. And there, the role of intermediaries to bridge that supply and demand is highly important. I'd like now, Chris, if you'd like to jump in and share your thoughts about what do you see in your crystal ball in terms of where do you put your money in terms of the transformational change here?
Well, I very much enjoyed hearing both what Art and Hans had to say. I'm far less optimistic that there is a single global magic bullet. I think we're going to need an arsenal, and it's going to mean taking all of these different approaches and rolling them into something that works. It will be a local response. I mean, the conditions are far too different to be able to find a single answer. I support the idea of both looking towards our youth and also towards technology. I think that part of the education, though, has to incorporate not only, I'm going to say, the dollars and cents or the purely agronomic approaches to the problem, but rather looking broad and looking to bring in more big scale thinking. So if I'm looking across the catena, what I'm really looking for is an answer that addresses all of the human problems. And that gets very difficult, particularly with water. Short of being able to create water either through cheap desalination or improved transportation, it's going to be a long haul, and it's going to be a long-term problem for us. So one that we should start working on now. It's not one just to pass on. I wanted to touch a bit on the idea of water futures markets and what they mean. Currently, most of the markets that I'm familiar with really are paper water markets and not wet water. Looking at paper water, it's prone both to market shocks, but also to market manipulation. So I'm not entirely comfortable that that is the answer that we're looking for. And particularly if I go back to my earlier point that I think water in large extent is a public good. So long as it's a public good, is it something that should be traded on a futures market? And if so, who should be trading and under what conditions? So, I mean, it's not a simple answer as yes, it's great, we're getting more finance into the sector. It's what does that finance mean? What is it actually doing? And is anybody getting more water because of it?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for also your reflections on the water future market, which indeed is interesting development. And of course, taking your cautionary note there is that indeed that I think that runs through all of these roundtable discussions. Is we're not just interested in the finance flowing into the sector, but what is it? What is the main outcome of that, and how can we make sure that finance is delivering? I also liked your point around the arsenal. Indeed, no magic bullets here. But Richard, you raised a number of these points around the opportunities for data, getting into riskier markets, et cetera, et cetera. What are your reflections, and where is IFC seeing really promising opportunities?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there are benefits to being the last to get this question, and then there are costs. The benefits are that I can think, and sometimes I sound a little smarter than I am, and the costs are that other people have actually come up with the answers that I would have given. So I'll take a crack at it. I think you've already heard, data and demographic shift, but I'll come back to them. I'd like to layer in there climate change as well. Climate change is refocusing people a little bit at a farmer level. If you are a farmer you're now experiencing things in a different way to the way that your father, your grandmother, your great-grandmother did when they were farmers. And so there is an opportunity there. And as a young farmer in the field, and there are many young farmers that we hope will stay in the field, you may be more open to technology. You may be more exposed to it. You've had a mobile phone in your life. You may have had access to electricity to the house and a whole range of tools. And you may also have experienced some combination of this product, service, and data that we take for granted now. You know, the Amazons and the Netflix, where you get product, service, and data all come together for this magic triangle. And so I think that as we look at it, we're saying, how can we blend education so we can reach these younger women who are going to be farmers, these younger men who are going to be farmers, and open them up to the opportunities. So it's a blend of education. It's riding the back of climate change and understanding that people are aware that this is impacting them. And so they can't do things, as I say, same way the mother, the grandmother, and the great-grandmother did. Agriculture has to change. So I think that's really what we see as an opportunity. And so when we aggregate our thinking, we sit as a team looking at manufacturing, agribusiness, and services, and that's the group I'm in. So we do look at education. We do look at how to manufacture the other, and then we look at what happens in the field. And so we take a more cohesive approach. But critical, I think, to changing this will be that blend of product, service, and data. Because if you have data on its own and the farmer can't make a decision, if you haven't educated her, you're not getting anywhere. If you have service, but you don't have the product, obviously that's not going to work. So you have to combine them, and bringing them together is fundamental. You heard so many good answers from the others that I don't want to repeat what they said.
Okay, well, great. Thank you, Richard. And I guess that's also an advantage for the moderator of the session to have great panelists, because I think you actually just wrapped up the discussion very, very well, pulling together all these relevant points. I won't endeavor to try to wrap up everything that was said. We're going to turn that over to have some closing remarks from Xavier Leflevre at OECD and from Sasha Kuwashima at FAO. But first, I would just like to thank our speakers in this session. To me, that was extremely insightful, and also makes me optimistic about how things are moving. And it sounds like there are a lot of new developments in the pipeline. So this is obviously a space to continue to watch and to learn from. And indeed, looking forward to continuing these exchanges with you as we move forward. So thanks so much. And with that, I'd like to close this session and hand over the difficult but interesting task of trying to wrap up and with closing remarks what we heard at this meeting. First, I'd like to turn to Xavier Leflevre, who leads our team on resilience, adaptation, and water at the OECD Environment Directorate, who will give some closing remarks and insights from the OECD perspective, and then we'll turn it over to Sasha for the final words from the FAO side. So Xavier, I think you've been listening intently. That's a lot to try to bring together, but I'm sure you will help us pull out some key points. And please, the floor is yours, Xavier.
Thank you, Kathleen. No pressure, of course. I usually volunteer to deliver these closing remarks, but I find this task today particularly challenging because of the wealth of the information that was shared. I mean, yesterday, Anthony Cox, our Deputy Director, in his introductory remarks flagged that we know very little about financing agriculture water, but apparently around the table there was a lot of knowledge. And I would certainly like to thank the chair, the panelists, and all the participants for sharing that knowledge in a very intense and lively discussion. The chat in particular was particularly lively, probably one of the most productive chat I've seen in the past few months. So thank you very much for that. We heard a lot about complexity. We heard about multiple objectives and trade-offs. Today, we even heard about multi-headed animals. We heard about disparities. I mean, farmers are different from corporates. Smallholders are different from large farms. We heard about regional disparities, Sahel, Central America, these are very different contexts. And obviously, all these disparities call for targeted interventions, which will remain context specific. I think that was a very clear and interesting message, probably even a counterintuitive message coming from the OECD from the last panel. So I think this is really something we have to, a message we have to take home. At the same time, we heard about innovation that can support integration, co-benefits in practice. And I would like to flag 4 types of innovations here, which I found particularly inspiring. One, innovative concepts. Yesterday, Mark Smith reiterated this idea of food systems as a way to frame issues in a cohesive way. That's probably an appropriate angle to pursue. In another dimension, we heard about innovative project design that can generate multiple benefits. Think about the presentation by TNC yesterday, and also project design at appropriate scales. We heard about landscape, the landscape being potentially one appropriate scale to consider projects and financial arrangements and look for synergies across financing flows. And that resonates with some of our ongoing work that Kathleen is leading on landscape banking. And I do think that the discussion yesterday and today provides some reassurance that this is probably a fruitful perspective. We also heard about innovative ways to value water and ecosystems. And here, obviously, there is a role for agri-water policies, a role that was reiterated by Chris Hartley today and my colleague Guillaume Gruyère yesterday. I think it's very welcome from an OECD perspective. Also, Henk Oving today explained how these innovative ways of valuing water and ecosystems can help turn agricultural water as a solution for resilient communities, not just a problem, but also they are part of the answer. And finally, we heard a lot about innovative financial arrangements, and that's really the bread and butter for this roundtable. Very interesting points about the experience with de-risking. And Dalian Zimmer yesterday insisted that de-risking is not merely non-financial, not merely financial instrument. There is a non-financial dimension in de-risking, and that's probably something we could explore further. We also heard about new investment funds, which have an interest in water and land use. So how to engage with these communities, how to stimulate further appetite here. The role of financial regulation that was very clearly mentioned by Henslot already today, today, that can drive investment flows and that can drive the different financial structure that need to be set in place. In that direction, I think all the discussion about the need for partnership that will bring expertise, that will contribute to de-risking is really interesting, and partnerships which can at the same time minimize transaction costs. I think that resonates again with the role, some of the work we are already doing under the roundtable on the role of intermediaries, because intermediaries can make projects scalable, that can minimize transaction costs, they can somehow standardize financing models or financing instruments. And we see that finances lack that kind of standardization, and as long as it can minimize transaction costs. Related to that, the reference to fintech, I think, was particularly inspiring, and it's probably something that we haven't discussed so much in the context of the roundtable so far, and that we would probably need to explore further. So on that basis, all these references to innovation are really food for thought for further collaboration between the OECD, the FAO, and our partners. And while we are closing this meeting, I think we have a very strong case to continue that conversation, probably with, under the umbrella of the roundtable, to be supported by more knowledge sharing, more case studies, more analytical work to move that agenda forward. So I'll stop there, Kathleen, and I would invite Sasha to provide her own remarks.
Thank you, Javier, for that wonderful round up summary of different views and different things. In the last 2 days, we heard numerous rich and thoughtful presentations on the challenges and experiences gained on. We have over 600 participants representing various stakeholder groups and from a wide range of expertise, from private sector, NGOs, to leaders in agriculture, financing, and environment. And I'm very pleased that there seems to be a convergence of view in the need for scaling up water financing for agriculture, where investments have fallen short over the past decade, as presented by several speakers, and that we need a new and better investments to address the current and future challenges that would deliver the multiple and also the interrelated goals of the SDGs by using responsible investment and using finance as a lever, as one of the levers to chart the course for a sustainable food systems future. FAO and many of our UN agencies are hosting the Food Systems Summit this year, and investments and the thoughts and reflections that have come about in these 2 days will be reflected in many of these events that will be going forward in bringing all the partners together. These investments also need to be accompanied by new generation of policies, and water investments, I've heard, needs to satisfy several objectives, and they need to be targeted. Innovative, not only in technology, but financing mechanisms and capacity building, and all these approaches are called for to ensure sustainability outcomes that would achieve food security, healthy environments, and also buffer on climate change. So robust water monitoring and water allocation systems, I've also heard, should precede any water infrastructure or even nature-based solutions or landscape approaches or green investment and green recovery, as we can't really manage what we don't measure. So FAO, in terms of the global standards and what global data collection, we do have the Aquastat database and also the remote sensed, the new remote sensed informatics that looks into the actual water consumption of agriculture. So it's no longer measuring abstraction, but actually what agriculture is consuming through evapotranspiration. So some of these informatics may be able to help in guiding various engagements and projects, as well as focusing on where are the needs for financing and projects and delivery. Water user engagements, including gender balance in decision-making, was also raised by our colleague in Yemen, and environmental and social factors are important to part of the policy side of the equation. So FAO and OECD, we intend for this meeting as a starting point for our conversation, and we will use these, the deliberations and all the thought-provoking outcomes from these 2 days of discussion towards our own FAO's future programming on agricultural water financing. Besides that, we also are delivering on a number of global events and readouts in terms of directions the global community should be going towards, and those type of policy-driven issues documents are also the things that we provide with OECD, for example, to the G20. This year, we also have the Convention for Biological Diversity, as well as the UNFCCC on climate change, and also the UNCCD on combating desertification. So a lot of these financing investment mechanisms would be assured and would be relevant in all of these discussions and pool all these different various sectors together. Our role at FAO is to ensure that we are inclusive as possible, and we will use this meeting to bring forward a platform serving as a way to assist in translating the richness and the variety forms of knowledge into policy-related actionable recommendations for consideration by FAO's technical committees as well, in fostering the consideration of cross-sectoral linkages between the different committees. We have fisheries committees, we have forestry committees, we also have Committee of Food and Agriculture and Committee for Food Security and Commodities and so forth. So all of these, the governing and statutory bodies need to be aware of what is happening on the ground. So we welcome all of our partners to come and join with FAO, our food coalition, our events happening that will inform policymakers and to continue to build partnership towards the transition for the food systems to addressing and enlarging the COVID recovery funds to build forward better. So FAO's multi-sectoral partnership-focused approach at the country level. I also wanted to mention that we have a hand-in-hand initiative. That initiative aims at these targeted interventions at scale at the local level. So through investing innovation, inclusive productive value chains, and building the human capital in a targeted investment strategy will be central to the success of this initiative. So what remains to be said is that at the end of this gathering, we shall be a new beginning of our joint work towards sustainable water and agriculture. And I thank all of you for your contributions, and particularly like to thank all the speakers and excellent participation by the participants for the rigorous discussions, and all the OECD and FAO staff who work endlessly in the organization of this meeting. Thank you. Back to you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Xavier, for that excellent wrap up. I'll just say a final thank you to everyone for joining. Indeed, the discussions under the Roundtable on Financing will continue, and including on this topic, and we'll look forward to meeting with you again, hopefully in person or in the virtual world, whatever the context allows. And please look forward to check out all of the meeting documents, presentations, and eventually a meeting summary will be on the meeting website. So please stay engaged, stay in touch, and we look forward to the next time that we see you soon. Thanks so much.